I'm kind of the warm-up band for Jeff Boothe. This sort of looks like my probability and statistics class at UCSC, maybe a little bit older. But other than that, no, indistinguishable. Actually, a little more awake, since I usually teach that class at 8 in the morning, which is it's hard to feed people a lot of math at 8 in the morning. So I'm going to run through some slides fairly quickly so we can get to Jeff. And what I want to do is I represent local knowledge, and I'm going to try to give a portrayal of what's possible here and how I've arrived at what I think about. George Dondero asked me to inform folks that many of you, most of you know there's been a rail feasibility study. So a rail feasibility study is not a plan. It's not a blueprint. It doesn't say dig here, build a station here, lock your bike here. It's a very general and abstract thing. It's like somebody saying, give me an even number greater than 11, 126. Well, that might be true, but it might not have anything to do with what ultimately happens. So a rail feasibility study is not a plan. It's just the first step of a very long process that Jeff will explain how could play out. Let's see if the clicker works. So making rail work is a matter of luck meeting opportunity. And so luck is preparation meeting opportunity. And the luck part of it has to do with the circumstances of our community. It has to do with density patterns. It has to do with viable options. We happen to have a rail line. If we didn't have that, this would pretty much be out of the question. If you tried to cobble this together out of buying up adjacent 1/5 acre lots, it would run about 700 million to $1 billion, and it would so be out of the question immediately. A population ready and open for solutions. This is very typical of Santa Cruz. And changing state and federal priorities, and this is what Jeff will speak to. So what would it take to make rail work here? So density, this comes up all the time. People say, rail couldn't possibly work in Santa Cruz. It's way too small. Well, population is not the same thing as density. Density is how many people there are in a square mile, for instance, and particularly how many people are near the rail line or a rail line that you're considering using. You need dense population. You need places to go near a rail line. You need a long, skinny development pattern. And, this is starting to become quite a laundry list of things that you need. In fact, most places in the U.S. don't have it. But Santa Cruz, as it turns out, does. So here's a density map. You can find this online at a website called socialexplorer.com. And this is Fresno. This picture is about 20 by 30 miles in extent, and it shows 972,000 people. And the key is way too small to read, but the densest parts in there are about 5,000 people per square mile, which is kind of more than suburban density, but it's nothing like San Francisco or Oakland or Berkeley. So here's a lot of people. You'll notice there's some denser parts, but they don't tend to be in disparate parts of the map, and they're not really strung together very well, and they're certainly not strung together in a line. So Fresno, even though it has 4 times the population of Santa Cruz County, is not necessarily a good bet for local rail transit, even though it's actually being considered there. Santa Cruz, this is a density map of Santa Cruz, and it doesn't show the rail line on it, but it runs mostly about a half a mile from the coast in the Capitola-Santa Cruz coastal plain, and then goes inland to Watsonville. In the dense part of the county, which is roughly between the west side of Santa Cruz and Cabrillo College, there's about 8,000 to 10,000 people per square mile. And these are densities that are not typical of a place this size. These are densities that are more typical of Oakland, Berkeley, Portland, Seattle, much bigger places. If you take the average density of the whole county, here's that probability and statistics class again, you get about 500 people per square mile, which is 1 per acre. It's not dense at all. But we're not about averages here. We're about what are things like along the rail line. Another issue that comes up a lot is the last mile. So how do people get from where they're going to the rail line, take a trip on the rail line, and then get off of it? Well, one key aspect is not to try to be everything to all people. Rather than serve a whole lot of people poorly, serve a smaller number of people really well. So the rail line does serve some people really well. It goes very close to downtown of Capitola and Santa Cruz. It goes within a few hundred yards of Cabrillo College, although as of yet, there is no easy way to get across, but that's what engineering is for. And it goes very near the new UCSC Marine Sciences campus that's being built in the Long Marine Lab area, and also the burgeoning west side of Santa Cruz, where many startup businesses are getting going right along the rail line. This represents between Cabrillo and the businesses and the Long Marine Lab area, and access to UCSC via Bay Street connection, many, many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. So it's important to have a population that would use it a lot. And I understand there are people who perhaps live in Corralitos and work in Scotts Valley who would probably hardly use it at all, but they would still benefit. And transportation options benefit all. You have many different ways of getting somewhere. This is like straws in a drink. And if there are more straws in the drink to soak up the transportation demand, there's less work to be done by each individual straw. So the rail line in this sense could take pressure off of the highway, off of the metro system, and so on, and work more effective, and that even people who don't use it really at all could benefit significantly. This is just some wild thinking on my own, rail spurs that might be worth the effort. It shows a little spur into the Marine Sciences campus, about 4/10 of a mile, and a little spur into Cabrillo College, which is about 2/10 of a mile. In fact, that's so short, wouldn't necessarily have to be a rail spur at all, but just a bike pedestrian bridge or underpass would make it very accessible. This is often a problem with American transit systems, is that they leave you in the middle of nowhere and they don't deal with the last mile. As anybody who's tried to take VTA in San Jose to the airport knows. So is a train a train a train? Well, this is a picture of an old Caltrain, a diesel locomotive hauling 4 cars. The whole thing weighs 460 tons and sounds like the earth is ending when it goes by you. And none of us want that. And for a long time, there weren't that many other options compared to this. But more recently, and this is stuff Jeff will talk about, there are new options that are not only electrically powered, but even more exotic than that, powered by batteries and ultracapacitors, and may not even need overhead wires. But I'll leave that to him. Here's an example of something we've all seen. In fact, I gave Jeff a tour of the line today, and we visited piece by piece from the San Andreas Trestle all the way to Natural Bridges, and we encountered quite a lot of traffic on Highway 1. So this is something you've all seen at some time or another. And a mile of traffic. Imagine a mile of stopped cars on Highway 1. Well, it turns out that at the average of 1.2 people per car, which is the national average, that represents about 360 people. And that's the same number of people that would fit in one of these rail vehicles pictured, a Siemens vehicle that's about 190 feet long, so 360 in both cases, except one uses 84 times less energy than the other. Here's some typical efficiencies worked out by a graduate student at Stanford. You see the rail works out at about 600 miles per gallon equivalent. And this is actually more relaxed assumptions than what I gave on the previous page, which would have a train with a lot of people standing and hanging from straps. The 600 miles per gallon equivalent is when people are sitting down, so more comfortable. You get even better than that if you really pack it full. But you notice that it just beats the heck out of anything else. So it's a very green solution. New technology, which again Jeff will talk about, batteries and ultracapacitors, and there's a lot of promise, and we live at a very fortunate time. We've looked into rail transit in Santa Cruz in the past, and we didn't have access to such technology, so the solutions looked different. They looked more complicated, heavier, more expensive, louder, more impactful, but things have changed a lot and are continuing to. So with that, I say all aboard, and I will introduce Jeff, who's the president of Boothe Transit Consulting. And, when I first got involved in the rail line, I knew it existed, but I read a few editorials in the paper around 2003 and 2004, and I thought, are they on to anything? Is this thing worthwhile? So I had a friend who was the head dispatcher of Union Pacific earlier in his life, and so I had him come down and walk it with me and a couple of other friends, including Micah and Piet. And he said, this thing is great. It's totally workable. It's a deal at $19.2 million. We ended up getting it for less than that. And so in that same vein, when I feel at sea, I seek out the best experts and invite them to weigh in on this. So Jeff Boothe is definitely one of the great figures associated with the modern American transit renaissance. Like many people, he got his start in Portland in 1982 and continued to work in transportation basically ever since. He's the executive director of the Community Streetcar Coalition, and he's on the board of directors of the American Public Transportation Association. Turned out also that we spent a couple of years within a few hundred yards of each other and never knew it. We were both undergraduates at Stanford, but we never met then because, well, he was majoring in political science, and I was majoring in physics and music, and we didn't have a lot of classes in common. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff.
Well, thank you for having me here today, and it's good to be here. And I sort of put it as next steps just because of where you are in the process. So we'll talk a little bit about process, but let me give you a little bit of background, and because I think I'm going to do a bit of riff off of my presentation to add a little information that will not be on the PowerPoint. We'll fold that into the presentation. Congress just passed a piece of legislation in December of this year called the FAST Act, which is a 5-year authorization bill, and that will have been my 8th authorization bill I've worked on. So what I wanted to do is just give you an overview of the federal program. It's called the Capital Investment Grants Program. It's authorized at $2.3 billion in that FAST Act that I talked about that just passed. It's called Fixing American Surface Transportation. Congress loves acronyms for all the bills it passes, so that's the acronym for this bill. It authorizes at $2.3 billion. But the president has asked for $3.5 billion. There's a lot of projects in the queue, and when you see, just to understand the program, there's 3 categories of funding within that program. The first is the New Starts program, which is those projects that are above $300 million in capital cost. There's the Small Starts program, which is projects that are under $300 million that have a cap of federal contribution of $100 million out of the 5309 program, which is the Capital Investment Grants Program. So if you see me use 5309 in the presentation, that refers to the Capital Investment Grants Program. And the last is what's called core capacity, and these are projects that are basically going into the existing rail systems and making system upgrades where they're at or near capacity. So for example, in this region, a project I've worked on is the electrification of the Caltrain corridor between San Jose to San Francisco is a core capacity project, and they're going in to basically to electrify the corridor, to introduce new vehicles that have larger capacity to deal with the demand on the system, which is on any given weekday, it's at about 96 to 99% of the capacity right now, and there are trains that are over capacity, where people are having to stand on the commuter rail system, which is highly unusual. And so they'll be getting funding from the federal government to basically to electrify the corridor and also buy new vehicles to add capacity to the line. So that type of project's funded out of the core capacity program. This just gives you an idea of the project approval process for new starts and small starts. And where I would say you are right now is you are that little yellow box just before project development. So that's where you are. So we'll talk a little bit about and this is a process. The group that I lead, the New Starts Working Group, worked very hard to change the program structure and to change the project delivery process. And so a lot of the decision making has been pushed earlier into the project development process with the idea that once you get environmental clearance to the National Environmental Policy Act, it's off to the races in terms of going and be able to do a P3, for example, public-private partnership with a private entity. The whole change in the program was to encourage that or to make it more possible to do public-private partnerships. So in fact, I'm working on a P3 project in Miami Beach right now on a streetcar project where we received an unsolicited proposal from a foreign entity to do the entire project, to do the construction, do the vehicle, and operate the system for a 30 to 35-year period. So we're entertaining those proposals right now, and the whole change in the bill was intended to sort of create those opportunities to allow the private sector to come in. So we're seeing big changes in the program as a result of the change in the program structure, but you're at the front end. So what's involved in that? I mean, so we talked about, you've done the initial feasibility study, and so what you'll need to do is sort of the next phase of that feasibility that gets into a little bit more nitty-gritty about the project corridor, to look at what are the technology options that you want to consider. What is the potential in terms of ridership? I mean, how many people will use it? Have a rough idea of what the ridership will be. Have some idea in terms of station locations. I think the alignment's pretty well defined. So the only issue, sort of to Bruce's point about some of the spurs, whether we want to add the spurs to part of the study of the project, but the alignment, because the existing right-of-way is pretty well defined. So I think you can narrow that down pretty quickly. And then to begin to look at alternatives. And the federal law requires you to look at a range of alternatives, but you do so under the Environmental Policy Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. You look at alternatives, and that's also the time to do community engagement, to reach out to stakeholders in the project corridor, reach out to the community, get community input as you begin to develop those options, to both make sure that people's views are heard in the development of the project, as well as to incorporate that so that you begin to address, particularly more so than anything, any of the environmental issues that may arise in the corridor that you need to address as you move your project forward. And so you begin the process with that, and really the goal is to identify also what the issues are that this corridor solves. And so being very clear under the environmental law, what is the purpose and need? So why are we doing this project? What is it trying to address? What are the issues that occur in the corridor? I mean, going into the corridor, to me, the issues are pretty obvious. I mean, so to me, it's not too hard to come to the conclusion about what the issues are that you're trying to resolve. And those issues are, you have constrained corridors, whether it be Highway 1 in terms of the capacity of that road, and it is pretty close to at capacity today. And you have the railroad corridor, and you have a tremendous amount of development, and you have a rail line that can basically put all the pearls on the string together and link all that development along the alignment. And so I think, to me, the purpose and need is pretty well defined, that you're trying to connect those areas of development, and more than anything, making it feasible for someone to come from one end of this county to the other end of the county without having to drive, because driving is a pain. I mean, trying to find a parking spot is almost impossible, right? And you have tremendous congestion for a community your size. I think that's part of the discussion about purpose and need, is that we can't find any more places for cars. Given the constraint that you have with the ocean on the one side and the mountains on the other side, you are capacity constrained. and so I would just say that, to me, is your start of your purpose and need. It's that we are capacity constrained in this corridor, and there's nowhere else we can go but to add capacity through the rail line, because there's no other place to do it. I mean, and that's just a fact in looking at the corridor. There is no other place to add capacity. And I think that has to be part of your discussion of the project. And more importantly, you're also trying to encourage people, and we'll talk about this in a minute, really change travel patterns in the corridor. And so, as I said, you develop the purpose and need, which really lays out the issues you're trying to solve. And then you need to do a level of engineering and design for that. And that's, the early part of it's like 5% design, just to have a rough order of magnitude of cost, and a rough order of magnitude of what are the issues that we're going to encounter in this corridor that we need to address. And so you need to understand, and part of that's going to be looking at the condition of the track, which Bruce has said, you've purchased a track, so what are improvements we need to make in the track, and understand the measure you're bringing to the voters is follow sort of the first step of that, to begin to make some of those investments, to look at what else we want to have happen in terms of doing better complete streets, other ways to have better connections to the rail line and to the proposed stations, so it makes it easier for people to access the stations. You want to consider that, so they're very context sensitive. So those are the kinds of issues you want to look at in the corridor as you begin to do a rough order of magnitude of the cost, so you have some idea, as you're selecting your locally preferred alternative, some idea of what it's going to cost. The fact is that the corridor is very well defined. And so I think in that respect, it doesn't call out for a more extensive environmental impact statement, because you operate an existing railroad corridor. And the beauty of your investment in that railroad corridor is that also qualifies as match towards the project. So the value of what you spend in the corridor now gets to count as match towards the ultimate project that you built. Yeah, nice, isn't it? And so you've already got, what, 14 million or whatever you paid for the corridor as a down payment as local match for whatever the cost of the project will be. So congratulate yourselves on your vision there, because that's very important. This measure right here, cost effectiveness, Congress made a major change in the last authorization bill. And the change was basically, before it was all about comparing a project to a freeway and saying we had to move as fast as the freeway. So therefore we had to put her in a corridor where we could have travel time saved and we could basically compete with the automobile. But what we're finding in a lot of metro areas is, and Bruce touched upon this, it's about the first and last half mile. It's about development around station corridors, and in your corridor, you're going through some very dense areas. You're going to have a lot of walk-up use of your system, as opposed to a lot of systems around park and ride lots. You're going to have a lot of walk-up use. You're going to have a lot of use that comes from the people discretionary use. If people say, I live here and I would never go to downtown, I'd never go to this restaurant because trying to find a parking space is a pain in the neck. But now with the transit system there, I can walk to that system or I can bike to that system, get on it, and go downtown and go to that restaurant and not have to hassle about finding a parking space. And so now you're taking a trip that you would never take because the whole notion of trying to drive there and park there was just more than I wanted to deal with. And so the corridor then opens itself up for you to do that. And so this measure, as I like to say now, instead of being travel time savings, it's about butts and seats. It's about, we don't care how far you go. You can go a mile, you can go one station, that trip all counts the same. So now it's about generating trips. It's about generating boarding. It's about getting people on and off the system to use it just to even go short distances. And you got a wonderful trip generator on this corridor potentially, and that's the University of California at Santa Cruz. And you look at university campuses around the United States that have access to transit, and the use is amazing. So figure out some way, to me, at some point in time, of getting to University of California, Santa Cruz, and finding a way to get there will be a tremendous way to generate trips from the university, because students are inclined to use transit. And we just see that over and over and over again at projects that connect to universities, that students want access to good transit. And if there's anybody from the university here, I would say that you want transit to your campus. Why? Because now you're no longer going to dedicate spaces to parking lots. You want to use that space for academic buildings, because now we're getting people out of their automobiles and using transit to access the campus. And a lot of universities are also adopting that strategy, a way to sort of reduce their carbon footprint, but also sort of create accessibility on their campus. And so I think those are long-term strategies to think about as you're looking at your project. I'm showing these slides largely to tell you what's coming to the United States or what's already here. And as I said, a lot of this is coming in the streetcar world. And why is it coming in the streetcar world? It's coming in the streetcar world because a lot of cities don't want overhead wires. It's from a viewscape standpoint, it's to historic preservation issues, or they're tackling other issues, but there's a lot of desire not to have overhead wires. So these are vehicles that are overseas in Europe. They're Alstom vehicles that give you some idea of some of the technology that they have overseas, that if, when the market happens in the United States, where there's enough demand for them to create the plant in the United States to comply with Buy America, they're coming. And I'll tell you, this one vehicle down here, that vehicle is the vehicle being proposed to use in Miami Beach. So they want to introduce this vehicle in the city of Miami Beach, which is basically a supercapacitor that's connected to an underground energy source along the corridor. So it's just an indication that that technology, if they win the bid in Miami Beach, that is the vehicle they'll be employing in Miami Beach. So that technology will be coming to the United States. So, I mean, I think the point is that there's a range of technology happening out there, and I think as you're moving forward with your project, the marketplace is driving solutions that you'll have a wider range of technology that will come to you as we begin to see this market take off in the United States, and as the manufacturers, most of whom are European, some are Japanese, will be bringing that technology into the United States as the market dictates and as there are opportunities out there. And with that, open up to questions.
The first question is, what about the use of freight on our rail line? We could ask Jeff to answer this, and if there's local information, then Bruce could chime in.
Okay, as I understand this, the line right now is still what is considered to be in the general system of railroads. It's still an active rail line. So at this point, in terms of the transit solution, would have to be a vehicle that could operate on freight railroad track, and you'd have to then go through what's known as a waiver process on the Federal Railroad Administration to operate a vehicle that is considered non-compliant, meaning that it's not a commuter rail car. And not that you would want a commuter rail car on the corridor, so don't take me to say that. I'm just saying that there are plenty of examples of where waivers have been given to operate on freight railroad track for a vehicle that doesn't meet the FRA vehicle standards. And so that process is available under federal law to the extent that you decide to keep the entire corridor as part of the general system of railroads, or you could decide to remove it from the general system of railroads, and therefore once you took it out of the general system of railroads, it would no longer be subject to Federal Railroad Administration for whatever portion of that corridor you took out of the general system of railroads. So that's a conversation to explore as you go down the road as to whether it's important to the community to keep the entire corridor active for freight railroad, or whether you want to only keep a portion of the corridor for active railroads. Those are all questions that should be part of the next phase of the process, is to look at those issues and look at sort of the long-term vision for what you want to have happen in the corridor, and make sure you preserve that vision for whatever it is you decide to do. But it is possible to operate transit on a freight railroad corridor, and it's done all around the United States today. So it is possible to do it, and the technology's out there that you can operate on that corridor. So that option's available to you if that's the pathway you decide to pursue.
Okay, this is a very related question, and you might just reframe it a little. I think you pretty much answered it, but is it true that our choices for passenger rolling stock are seriously constrained by FRA crash worthiness standards?
And the answer to that's no, because as long as you operate what's called temporal separation, which means that you separate the freight service from the transit service and operate, and they don't commingle. So as long as you separate the freight service, if you decide to keep it in freight operations, and separate that by time of day from the transit service, you can run a transit vehicle on the railroad corridor, and you would not have to comply with the FRA crash worthiness standards, which are 800 buff strength at the post of the vehicle. You don't have to do that, and so you get a waiver from the Federal Railroad Administration to operate that vehicle at a time of day where there is no active freight service in the corridor. So that's done throughout the United States. It's done in San Diego right now. If you've been to San Diego, that system operates under temporal separation today.
Great.
Yeah, I keep lifting and it keeps slipping here. Let me see if I can raise to keep it up there. There we go. I'll also move it closer to my mouth so it. Okay, how's that? Is that better? Okay. Thank you for reminding me.
All right. Question for Jeff. This is a long one, but I feel like it was a great question. A long answer, I think. What other communities in the United States are similar to Santa Cruz County and are further along that already have working rail lines or are further along in the design and build process?
Oh, wow. Okay.
You're here, Jeff. We got good questions for you.
Okay, well, one system you may want to take a look at that's in the state of California is the North County Transit District system. They have a freight railroad line, which is the coaster, and I always forget the Sprinter. That's what it is, the Sprinter that runs from Escondido up to the University of California, San Marcos. It is on a freight railroad corridor, but it's an electric multiple unit vehicle, an EMU. And then if you go up further north to Sonoma Marin Area Regional Transit, they're going to run electric multiple units on the corridor. So they operate on a freight railroad corridor, but they're not commuter rail vehicles. So you have some examples already in your state of a type of vehicle you could run on that corridor that would be able to operate on the freight railroad corridor, but operates under time of day separation. So you have some examples already in the state. In terms of others who are ahead of you, looking at your corridor, you have a very unique corridor, and I say that not in a negative way, actually an incredibly positive way, because when Bruce took me on the corridor, I'm struck at a substantial part of the corridor. You already have density. You already have development on the corridor. So many other places use the projects to sort of create nodes of development, and use it as a tool, as an economic development tool to sort of shape development in their region or to shape development in the corridor, you already got development in the corridor. You actually have a lot of little, I don't know what you call it, villages or little places where there's commercial activity at potential rail stations that's already there. A lot of other places would try to use the station to generate that kind of development. You already have it there. So the fact is, for much of the sort of densely part of the corridor, you already have development, you already have density that a lot of cities would kill for. So, and you have it at a scale that I think is appropriate for your community. I mean, you don't want a scale of like Miami Beach, we're talking 90-story condos. That is not what you're looking for. You're really looking for context-sensitive development, given what you're having in the community. You already have that development, and you already have so many people that live so close to the line. You're gonna have a lot of walk-up transit, people who live in the corridor, are simply gonna walk or bike to the line because of their proximity to that line. And so I think that really makes this project really unique compared to a lot of the other corridors that I've been involved in, where they don't have that kind of alignment that you have right now.
Great. Yeah, I like to tell people when they say, are we dense enough for rail? Yeah, the only thing we're missing is the train. Other than that, we're already dense enough, right?
No, I mean, I worked on the Portland streetcar project back in the day. You know, the history of the Portland streetcar project is all that development you see there wasn't there. None of it was there. That was a warehouse district. And the first order of business was to remove the end of a freeway ramp to move it so that we could create greater density in the project corridor. And the city did that, and we got federal funding to be able to move the ramp to open up the Pearl District to development. And then the city essentially invested in great incentives to developers, sort of built the project in that corridor with the idea that they would hope that it would drive development. So what you see there in the corridor is really a function of the streetcar driving that development, but all that development you see there was not there when they started building the streetcar project. It was just warehouses. I mean, that was the warehouse district of the city, and now it's some of the densest development in the city of Portland that happens in that corridor. But that was all a function of city policy plus using the streetcar to really focus on the first and last mile of somebody's trip, because 50% of the ridership on the streetcar comes from the existing light rail system. So it's really people starting or ending their trip. But the other beauty of the Portland streetcar is it also connects to Portland State University. It goes right through the heart of the campus. And so you get a lot of student use, you get a lot of use in the corridor, because for the reasons I talked about before, is that people now take a lot of discretionary trips because it's so much easier to walk to transit and get to your destination than it is to think about driving your car to the destination. And so and you have a lot of that. You have a very walkable, I mean, the location is very walkable to a lot of residents in the corridor because it is right there smack dab where you have density already.
All right, here's a related question for Jeff. How do completed stations affect real estate values and rents in the immediate vicinity?
I think that it's funny, you should have been in my presentation. I was on a panel with the New Partners for Smart Growth in Portland on Saturday, but we talked about some of that. And I think if you look at the studies now that are taking place, that the TOD footprint, or the transit-oriented development footprint now is about a half-mile radius of a project. So that's where you're going to get development impact. But as I said before, what's fascinating to me is you already have development along the rail line. I mean, and so the only issue is how much desire or appetite there is for redevelopment for much of the corridor, whether we want to just preserve it the way it is and then focus on, like, down by the Marine Science Center area down there where you have that park down there. Maybe we use that for some additional TOD and really let the rail project shape that development and let it really make it sort of rail facing, as opposed to just having it happen and then trying to squeeze rail into there. And that should be a conversation you're having with the university about how do we preserve the opportunity to really provide better access to rail transit to that site and to that part of the academic campus. And then, but really other than, and then maybe looking at the ends where there isn't quite as much development, but in the heart of the project, in like City of Santa Cruz, there's frankly, I'm not seeing there's a lot of places for a lot of redevelopment because it's pretty well developed already. And I think you'll probably get a lot of nodded heads in the audience. I also think that many of you feel very strongly about the context of that development. And I think you've got the scale and you got the size of the development, you're probably pretty comfortable with it. Also would be pretty transit supportive. So I think given the proximity of the line to where people live and where those shops are, and given the destinations on the line, I think you're going to get a fair amount of ridership just because of that proximity. And also, the last thing I'll say is because a lot of times you get this conversation with folks and they worry that TOD is, as I used to say, Cabrini Greens everywhere, if you're familiar with Chicago and the old housing projects. That isn't what we're talking about. We're talking 3- and 4-story garden apartments. That's density that in most corridors supports development. Now what you have is you actually have smaller blocks for a lot of your houses. And so you actually have greater density because you have smaller blocks and you have houses that are much more compact than a lot of communities have. So you actually have density based on block size and house size that would support transit. So I mean, because I look at your corridor, like where I grew up in Portland, and they don't have that kind of density on the corridor. I mean, they don't, the density, what they have is more vertical density. You have more horizontal density because of the size of your houses and the blocks and the proximity of those houses to the alignment. You have density already.
Great, thanks, Jeff. This is really helping us put the pieces together. So you mentioned in your presentation that part of your prognosis about when you're doing your planning is to get a ridership projections that are accurate. So how can, in your experience, how does a community accurately estimate the potential for ridership? And then how does that fit in with encouraging ridership as the project goes forward?
Okay, so I guess the question is, I don't know who controls the regional travel demand model here, but every region has to develop a travel demand model, and it's based on a set of assumptions about development and density and housing units in a project corridor. But the problem is it's generally a highway-based model. So it's really built around freeways. It's not built around transit. And so most communities have to make some investment in the model to really pick up transit trips. But I would also say that your model needs to be even further refined to really pick up the walk-up trips, because most travel demand models do a very poor job of picking up discretionary trips. And what's interesting about your corridor is that usually we look at discretionary trips in terms of major sports venues, major hospitals, major employment centers. But you're going to get trips because people just look and say, I want to go to this restaurant, or I want to go here, but man, I really don't want to drive my car because I just don't want to hassle with trying to find a parking space, right? And I think you'll find that the model you really got to work on the model to pick up that trip that says, now I actually will take a trip that I would never ever thought about taking, because now it's doable using transit. And Portland coined this with the streetcar project called the trip not taken. And basically the point of that study that was done by Eric Hovey was to pick up and identify the trip that somebody would never have taken but for the existence of the streetcar that now made that trip possible. And I see a lot of that in the corridor, given the density and given the challenges of finding parking and just traveling through certain parts of the corridor. I mean, I don't know if today was representative of the congestion you have in parts of the city, but I know but in the summertime, you're going to have that every day. So, I mean, I think, so one tip, one word of advice to you, if you ever want to convince the federal government to make an investment in your project, bring them here on the busiest day of the summer. Okay, so let them drive down from San Francisco, take them on Route 1, then take them into the corridor and let them see what it's like in downtown Santa Cruz on a peak summer day. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm not just kidding, this is like you need to tell a story and you need to expose them and tell your story so they have an appreciation of what the challenges are that you're trying to solve in the corridor. Because sometimes words and images don't do a good enough job. That sometimes you just have to bring people and see it for themselves to have a sense of what it is you're trying to do, because your community is a bit of an anomaly, and Bruce sort of spoke to this, and I actually work in Jacksonville, and I totally agree with him. It's one of the nation's most populous cities, but it is the least dense city you will ever see in your life. San Antonio is the same way. I do work in San Antonio. It's the most sprawled city I've ever seen in my life. And so they may have population, but they have no density in either one of those cities. Nothing even comes close to your density. So population's not the measure. The measure is density in the project corridor, and really within a half mile of distance of the alignment and station areas, to look at the density within that proximity of those stations to tell your story about what the challenges that you're trying to solve in the development and the ridership that'll take place.
Okay, please, we know everyone has a lot of comments and questions, so if you could keep them to the cards. Okay, thanks. Just a reminder that we could use your donations because we had to rent the hall, and Jeff's been very generous, but we, put him up for the night and all that. So there's people in the back ready to take your donations. A related question is, how does recreational, in other words, tourist rail, people riding around the rails for fun or whatever, in your experience, Jeff, how is that compatible with the kind of transit rail use that we've been talking about?
Okay, once again, given the amount of tourist traffic that you have in the summertime or times like today, that's what we call in the transportation parlance off-model ridership, meaning that the models that you usually have for evaluating ridership are really around the commute trip, right? It's peak hour, morning and afternoon rush. And while you have that, you also have a lot of trips that won't show up and they're not event-based trips because they're not based on having a big basketball game in an arena or having a football game going on in an arena, so we can identify those trips for a certain number of dates per year. During the summertime, you're going to have that every single day. And that congestion it's going to get masked in the data because it's very sort of parts of the times of the year, certain days of the year, beyond what you have during sort of normal rush hour traffic. And so I think part of that is sort of communicating that to the federal government, sort of the challenges that you face and the impact that congestion has on your community that's beyond just the peak hour, it's beyond rush hour. And sort of talking about that and sort of telling that story about sort of as part of your purpose and need, what it is you're trying to address at the project corridor.
Thank you. We had a few questions. You could tell people were listening about the last mile thing because a few people asked, and this is probably a question for Bruce. How will people specifically get from Bay Street up to UCSC? Is it possible to put a rail line up the middle of Bay? Someone asked, and someone else asked, is it feasible to do an overhead system like a people mover? Just Bruce, if you could, I know you don't have a clear answer. Either one of you can weigh in on this actually, but
well, we talked about this while we were sitting in traffic on Highway 1, and we thought that I did bring up the fact that there's a lot of potential trips at UC Santa Cruz and that there is now an effective bus system that uses Bay Street a lot. So at the very least, there would be a coordinated linkage between rail and bus at the Bay California Street intersection area. And that we also talked about, might it be possible for electric rail vehicles to actually get up to UC Santa Cruz? And Jeff was asking me, well, what the gradient was, and I said, well, for the most part, 4 to 6%. And he said, well, technologically, it's feasible. Of course, this means a new alignment, and a new alignment is expensive, so I thought we'd actually probably concentrate on the alignment we had first, but this is something that is probably in the back of a lot of people's minds.
And just to add to that, okay, so the grade, typically the steepest grade you're going to run a rail car on is about 7%. So the fact you're 4 to 6%, that's been done before, and that technology's out there. But to Bruce's point, the issue is you're looking at capital cost to get to the university and sort of looking at versus the rail core, which is already there. So you already have a defined core. The issue getting to the campus is, okay, what's the most cost effective, what's the most sensitive, what's the solution that works best to sort of capture that population? Is it an extension of the rail system? Is it some sort of enhanced bus service? Is it bus rapid transit? I mean, that's all that have to be looked at is what's the best way to connect the campus to the rail line. And I think that's got to be part of the study, and then the decision for you is, do we focus on the existing core and then sort of figure out an interim solution for that and maybe that becomes the next phase once we've sort of demonstrated the existing. I mean, those are all issues you'll have to walk through from a strategic development standpoint as you advance the corridor, look at sort of what do you have available in terms of funding. And I will say this, that in many places where I work where there is a university involved, many universities support the transit system through student fees, basically paying for the operating cost of the bus systems on the campuses through student fees. And a lot of universities, like I'm working on a project in Ann Arbor where the University of Michigan will probably help pay a substantial portion of the capital cost of the project because it makes their campus more walkable. It makes their campus more accessible. And it basically, they see it as avoided cost. Now we can have the rail system on the campus and we don't have to build parking garages. So part of your conversation with the university is, okay, looking at your long-range plans for the university and looking at how to accommodate student populations, is there a way to do an avoided cost analysis that says, okay, if you make this investment, you're going to avoid this cost that you otherwise had planned on making, because we see it as a better way to deal with access to the campus? So those are all issues to sort of look at as you look at the campus and look at their growth plans to see how you can better connect the campus as you have a project on the rail line.
I look at, even in the really short, simple term, in terms of cost efficiencies, imagine instead of the buses having to go all the way through the lower west side and downtown and use the metro station, if we just had those buses going from Bay in California back up and Bay in California back up, we'd save a lot of money and reduce a lot of traffic in local neighborhoods. So I just think in terms of the simpleness of things.
And to that end, okay, in the Portland streetcar, part of the way they came up with the operating costs for the project was the TriMet, which is the transit operator for the city, basically said, okay, this streetcar is taking the place of our bus, of what we would otherwise invest in bus service. And they just attributed that money to the streetcar operations, because said now we don't have to run these buses on this route because the rail line is taking the place of those buses. And so now we can basically take that operating money and apply it towards the streetcar. So that was one of the ways they were able to assemble the operating plan for the project, was taking a look at those types of things. And so I think there's a lot of tools out there for both the capital and operating side to be explored as the project moves forward to help pay for both the capital costs and the operating costs of the system.
That sounds so sensible for local government. What a strange thing happened. Another question is, has any thought been given, I think I'll just answer this one. Has any thought been given to using streets like Woodrow, Cayuga, or Pine for new streetcars? I don't think anyone's thinking about that yet, because as Jeff and Bruce have explained, we have so many possibilities with our existing rail line that it's not that that's impossible, and I don't think anyone's really thinking about that yet for those streets, for extra streets. The next question is, I guess it's for, well, either one of you. What work will need to be done to increase the speed at which light rail can travel on the tracks?
Well, one of the upsides you have in the corridor is that other than at the crossings, it's a dedicated right-of-way. I mean, so basically one of the upsides is that where it can get to speed, because it's not operating on a city street. And the only places, and you have a lot of the only issue would be then in the court where it crosses a street is sort of having a sealed corridor, basically a 4-quadrant gate, that when the train comes in, it signals and the gates drop to allow the train to go through, so you don't have interaction with automobiles. And that's typically done around light rail systems all around the United States as the way to sort of protect the corridor and to allow it to maintain speed, so it doesn't have to stop at the intersection unless, of course, there's a station there. Then it will obviously stop there to pick up people. But I think the corridor, the issue really will be the condition of the track and what upgrades have to be made to the track to allow it to carry, one, the weight of the vehicle that you're contemplating utilizing, and then secondly, to make sure that the condition of the track is such that it can maintain those speeds, because a lot of freight railroad track, is not graded to be at 79 miles an hour. It's at a lower grade based on the condition of the track. So you'll want to look at track condition to determine what investments have to be made to get it to be able to operate your system at the speed you want to operate on that track, and look at what needs to be done to the track to bring it to that level of speed. And that's part of what an early engineering analysis should take a look at and sort of get an idea of what that capital cost will be.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes for questions, and then we can mix and talk afterwards. And then also, as I said, Barry has volunteered that questions that don't get answered, we'll post the answers on our website. This is, I think, somewhat of a challenge. Someone's been doing their homework. They read the RTC feasibility study, which determined that electric vehicles were cost prohibitive and recommended DMUs, or locomotives. DMUs are kind of like buses that run on tracks, diesel multiple units. So wondering if either of you has read the study or looked at the study and has a response as to, why electrical vehicles, which we've talked about today, would be a reasonable option.
Well, I've read the study, being local, and the main extra cost of electrical vehicles is the overhead wire called the catenary, and putting that from the running catenary over the entire distance from Watsonville to Santa Cruz would be quite expensive. which is why we're overjoyed to hear about the possibility of supercapacitor and battery-powered vehicles, where might be able to live either without a catenary at all or just in very limited places. So this is very good news.
Yeah, I would say that CAF, which is a Spanish company, I mean, there's so many different technology options out there. For example, CAF, which is a Spanish company, has a vehicle that they're going to introduce, I think it's in Hong Kong, or not Hong Kong, Taiwan, that basically raises the pantograph at stations to draw power and then utilizes that power to go to the next station. So it only raises the pantograph when it dwells at a station to pick up people, and then it operates on that charge to operate for the balance of the system. Not that it needs to charge just to get to the next station, but it's basically recharging. And so that technology options out there that CAF is looking at. So, I mean, my point is that the world is changing rapidly with respect to technology, that what we once knew is changing rapidly. And I'd say the biggest changes are supercapacitors. It's a different type of battery, a different type of sort of charging of a vehicle. You know, the Brookville project uses a more traditional lithium-ion battery. But I think the world of batteries, if you're familiar with Elon Musk and Tesla, I mean, when you're spending billions of dollars to look at battery technology, we haven't begun to see where battery technologies are going in terms of their ability to charge and to power vehicles. And so I think we're at a very interesting time in terms of technological development that it comes in the area of transit and rail transit, where we're seeing lots of those options out there, and lots of those options are currently overseas. And the issue for the manufacturer right now is that technology is out there, but they're looking at the U.S. market, and they're looking, okay, is there enough of a level of interest out there for me to bring this technology to the United States to meet the federal requirements for Buy America, which is you now have to have, it used to be 60% of the domestic content had to be domestic. Under the FAST Act, that percentage will raise to 70% by the end of the 5-year period. So for them, that's an investment in U.S. plant and U.S. capacity to bring that vehicle to the United States, and they're looking at their sunk cost and saying, okay, where's that point where it makes sense for me to bring that technology into the United States so that I can sell enough of that technology to recoup our investment given the demand out there. And I think they're all looking at the market, they're looking at that possibility, and sort of all waiting to determine when to jump. So like Brookville's the first to jump, but they're a much smaller manufacturer, and so they were willing to make that investment to try to get to be the first to market. And I have experience with this because with Siemens in the Portland system, Portland was the first light rail car to go low floor. I mean that they got rid of the wheelchair ramp and they basically went to low floor. So from an accessibility standpoint, you didn't have to walk up steps to access to the rail car. Siemens saw the opportunity and gave them a phenomenal price, knowing that the moment they introduced that technology in the United States, that every other light rail system would want to go that direction, and they were right. Now you only see older systems that have walk upstairs. All the newer systems all have direct access to the train. I think you're going to see the same thing in the streetcar world. And the rail car vehicle world. You're going to see as the manufacturers see an opportunity. If there's a transit systems willing to make that investment, it will drive the market. And there'll be some manufacturers, once they see that, they will enter the market, they'll make the investment in the market, and you'll see that technology come to the United States. And that's why I mentioned the Miami Beach project. I think with Alstom, they're seeing it as a way to get their technology into the United States, to get other cities to buy off of that contract. And likewise, I've just begun working on a project in Brooklyn to Queens, New York, which is a 14-mile light rail / streetcar system that they want to use off-wire for the bulk of the line. Well, shoot, if you're familiar with Brooklyn and Queens, I mean, the number of vehicles they're going to have to purchase there will drive the market. And whoever wins that bid will own the U.S. market, or at least will have a substantial driver to sort of the market. The technology they use will really influence the market in the United States, and others will follow. So I think, and those things are going to happen sooner than, as you work on this process, they're a little bit further along than you are. So I think these market developments are happening, and they will drive the market, and this technology will come to the United States. So I think you're at a propitious time when it comes to looking at alternatives to overhead catenary wire for the corridor.
There are other questions here, and they're all good. My mom always told me every question's good. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, and we'll try to post the answers on our website at coastalrail.org. I'm going to answer one more question as a, kind of a segue. This is a political question. In spite of the good work on its feasibility study, it seems that the RTC has failed to take ownership of the rail opportunity. Why is the RTC not promoting rail? Well, this is a political question. I'm going to give it a political answer. The RTC does literally own the rail and the rail line, thanks to all of us and the RTC. And the RTC is taking ownership. They're planning, the RTC, the Regional Transportation Commission, is planning on a trail, and the Regional Transportation Commission is studying rail options for passenger rail. Now, why aren't they promoting rail? Well, as a public servant, let me tell you, that's not the government's job to promote things. If we want rail on that corridor, if we want public transportation on that line, if we want a cool electric trolley or train that's super efficient and gets people around, that's our job to promote it, to push for it, to talk to the elected officials and say, this is something we really want. And if you're in that boat, I encourage you to get in touch with coastalrail.org, talk to your neighbors, and I'm so appreciative as someone that is interested in that we had some real live facts here to help us think about this and create a vision for Santa Cruz County. Let's appreciate our speakers. Thanks so much for coming. We only have a few more minutes here in this room, so if you want to have long conversations, go have them in the public street. But I appreciate you being here.